Hi everybody, today I'm going to be doing a comparison video, my first comparison video, between these three UK legal carry flip joints. Now they are all at quite different price points, but I think it's going to be an interesting comparison anyway. But before we get started, I want to say that this is not a full review. Each of these knives will get their own review over the coming weeks, I'm hoping, depending on how things go. And I also want to say that if you live in a country where there is no laws limiting you from carrying a locking knife, I strongly encourage that you do that instead. They are just safer. I'll chuck a couple of them in here so you can see some other options that you might want to consider. Here is the Civivi McKenna, which is a front flipper. Very similar materials, in fact exactly the same blade steel as the Civivi Appalachian drifter that we have there. Here is a Kershaw Atmos, which is an 8CR, which is the same blade steel as the CRKT and roughly the same money. And we'll also throw in a Benchmade Bug Out, which is a slightly larger knife, but being a very light knife, very thin knife, it carries like a smaller knife. So it's an option that I would consider alongside some of these if you're looking for an EDC knife and locking knives are not a legal issue for you. Now, I think that's also going to serve as our size comparison for this video, because these three are much of a muchness anyway. But I will have some other UK legal carry options in here at the end if you want to see it compared to those. So we're going to start with deployment. All of these knives are double detent style knives. They all run on bearings, and the action is basically as you would expect. The action with these knives absolutely gets better as these knives increase in price. So the CRKT has an acceptable action. It's okay. I suspect that the bearings are not the best. The actual ball bearings themselves are very, very small when you take this knife apart. And the flipper tab is, I find the flipper tab quite unpleasant. It's a thin blade stock and it is jimped. And it has this kind of large flat area here. It works okay as a normal flipper, but again, it is a little bit sharp. But having all this piece here, I would kind of expect I'd be able to front flip it, but I just can't, and I mostly can't, because the rest of this massive flipper tab hits my hand. If we compare that to another front flipper at a similar angle, see there's nothing sticking out here, and there's this piece sticking out here. So the McKenna, very easy to front flip. The CRKT Symmetry, I can't get it with the front flip at all. I never have. As a normal flipper, it works okay, but the flipper tab is just not my favorite. It also has a very light blade, and because it has a detent ball, I don't think you'll be able to see this on camera. Perhaps if I get some light underneath. Yeah, so you can see here there is a detent ball making contact on each side of the blade when the knife is open, and in this position you can see that this detent ball is partially in on this side and this one is sitting completely on the surface. Now that means that there's a detent ball making contact with each side of the blade the whole way around as this blade opens, and then they both fall in there. That means that there's a lot more friction on this blade than there would be on a more conventional knife like this ZT, which is a frame lock knife which has one ball bearing in it and is very, very smooth. So that means that this knife will certainly not drop shut. You have to tap it quite a lot to get it to close. It's easy enough to close when you put pressure on it yourself. You can sometimes get it to flick shut like that, but it's not particularly smooth. On to the Appalachian drifter. Now the Appalachian drifter has a very minimal flipper tab. See, it barely sticks out at all. But it works very well. The action on the Civivi is definitely a jump ahead of the CRKT, and the fuller on this knife is wonderful because it allows you to easily thumb roll the knife open instead of using the flipper if you prefer. And you can even middle flick it, which is more difficult under camera, but with a little bit of risk. There we go. You can absolutely middle flick this knife. Come on, Liam. There we go. Can absolutely be middle flicked. This knife also has a light blade, and see if we can see it on this knife as well. Yeah, it also has two detent balls. You can see them both drop into the blade there, both lifted up and on the blade, and then as it closes, I think both in this case are partially in, just a little bit shallower than the fully open position. So again, it's not going to be a drop shutty knife. It is smoother than the CRKT, absolutely, but it's not super smooth. It does, however, pop shut a bit easier. I think you already saw that, but it does pop shut quite nicely. That's probably because the open position detent is quite strong, so by the time the open position detent breaks to allow the knife to close, the knife blade's moving relatively quickly and it carries itself shut quite easily. Onto the Slayback. The Slayback has a bigger flipper tab than the Appalachian Drifter, but it's a similar kind of style and position. This is my favourite flipper tab of the bunch, and well, there's not much in it. The Appalachian Drifter is pretty good, but this blade stock is quite a bit thicker, which means this flipper tab is quite a lot thicker, which just makes it more comfortable, and I find it a bit easier to hit and to open the knife with. However I choose to open it, I find it very easy with this flipper tab. The jimping on it is also quite nice. It's not as uncomfortable as the jimping on the CRKT. Now this is the only knife here that has a single detent. You can see here there's a detent making contact there, but not one on the other side. And as it swings round, closed position detents back in, and again, of course, still nothing on the other side. Now that means that you can't, the manufacturer can't fine-tune the open and closed position detent separately, because the force that the detent ball is pushing against the side of the blade with means it's going to have the same amount of resistance for the open and the closed position, because it's the same detent. And that means that the opening detent is maybe a hair stiff, and that the closing detent is maybe a hair light. But the kind of positive you get from that is that this is a lot smoother. Maybe it was a wee bit off camera there. If I just give it a little shake, it drops shut really pretty easily. It's a far smoother knife than the other two. Overall, in terms of deployment, I would probably have to give the win to the Appalachian Drifter, simply because of the fuller, and it's very easy to thumb roll. If you are in the UK like I am and you're carrying a UK legal carry knife, a lot of the times you might be in a situation where that would get a scared reaction from people, unfortunately. Look at that, first time that time. First try that time even. And the ability to thumb roll the knife is very handy. Still one hand opening, but you can do it a bit slower and a bit less scary if you're around someone who is a bit afraid of knives. So I would have to give that category to the Appalachian Drifter. The Civivi Appalachian Drifter also has notably the strongest detent, followed by, strongest open position detent anyway, followed by the Slayback and then the CRKT. However, you would think that would make the CRKT less safe, but with the CRKT, this part of the flipper tab mechanism, I'll move these two so it's a little bit clearer. This part of the flipper tab mechanism rises up from the spine of the knife as the blade starts to close. And that means if you put your thumb there, the knife won't close because your thumb is pushing that piece back down and holding the knife open. Problem with that is it's quite a precise point. If you're holding it a bit too far up, it can fold round enough to catch your finger, and if you're holding it a bit too far back and you miss it, it can come round enough to catch your finger. So you have to be quite careful to keep your hand in the right place. And because this blade stock is thin and this piece is jimped, it is quite uncomfortable when that happens. It does dig into your thumb quite notably. But if you make sure your thumb's in the right area, that's quite a handy safety feature. The Slayback has a jimped piece down here, which comes out of the handle as the blade starts to close. And in my opinion, this works far better than the CRKTs. Perhaps just because it's on this side of the blade, the way that the blade is coming. But if I grip here, almost directly underneath the pivot, and I push on the spine of the knife, you can see that that edge won't touch my finger. If I come even further forward, right up next to the edge, that edge is not quite touching my finger. If I come further back, the blade starts to close, but the flat, unsharpened area makes contact with my finger first, a bit further back. So you have to be about back there before it's going to start to actually cut you. So you've got from here, from there, to there. You've got a bigger area of safe gripping area where your hand's going to stop the blade closing on your fingers. And because it's a thicker blade stock, it's more comfortable when that happens. So I think this knife is the safest of the bunch. Because despite having the strongest detent, the Appalachian Drifter has no piece whatsoever to let your hand hold it in place, unless you count that right at the end. But if you're holding it in a normal manner, it's already far too late by that point. So despite having the strongest detent, I would say that the Appalachian Drifter is actually the least safe, and I would have to give the win in that category to the Slayback, followed by the the CRKT. In terms of materials, the CRKT looks far more expensive than it is. The blue hardware helps this knife look way more classy, but if you look at it quite close, you can see that the blue on this screw, and this screw are very different, as well as these screws. See, this back screw here is very, very dark, quite a dark purple colour, whereas this front screw is a very light blue, and there is a bit of variance in them on the back as well. So the screw, it's nice that they've done brightly coloured screws, but they're not particularly consistent. The inlays are just textured plastic, basically. It's textured to kind of look like carbon fibre, and surprisingly I think it looks okay. Usually I don't like it when people try and make things that aren't carbon look like carbon, but in this case I think it looks alright. The inlays are quite well fitted, and the fact that they are inlaid and you have steel edges right the way around really makes this knife feel more expensive and more classy than it actually is. So that's a very pleasant thing with this knife, really. Although, missed the flip there, the massive CRKT and then their IKBS logo, Symmetry, Richard Rogers design, serial number, all that writing on the blade kind of takes away a bit of the class from this knife as well. It cheapens it up a bit, I think, which is a little bit of a shame. The Civivi is available in many different versions. This one here has the Damascus blade, and the scales are carbon fibre and G10. So the black areas that you're seeing here are carbon fibre, and the grey areas are G10. It's different layers which have been cut through. I don't like that, really. I think that just looks worse than just proper carbon, because the proper carbon, as the light moves, the different parts of the pattern are caught and your eye's drawn to different bits. Whereas with this, the G10's kind of flat, and because there's less carbon, you don't really get to see much of the carbon kind of playing with the light, if you like. So I'm not really a fan of that. If it had been a brighter colour than this grey, something a bit more eye-catching, I might be a bigger fan of it. But with the grey as it is, I just think it doesn't look as nice as proper carbon. I wish they'd gone with just pure carbon or added a brighter, different colour to the G10. I do, however, like that they've done this little bit of machining here, which gives you a kind of bolster look to the front piece. Even though it's not a true bolster, it looks quite nice, I think. Personally, if all of the models of this had been available when I bought this one, I would have gone for the S35VN model in green micarta. It's a better performance blade steel, a lot better performing blade steel, and you don't have this G10 carbon thing. So I would have gone for that model if it had all been available when I bought this one. So the Slayback. The Slayback is available in full titanium, regular carbon fibre, and this raindrop carbon. There is also some black DLC coated ones, but they are very, very rare. I'd honestly be happy with any version of this knife. I don't think any of them look bad whatsoever. I actually ordered the regular carbon one and by mistake ended up with the raindrop carbon, and then I sent them a message and said, hey, I got sent the raindrop carbon, but I love it, can I keep it? And they said, yes, of course. So I ended up with the raindrop carbon, and I really like it. It's grown on me a lot. It looks a lot better in person than I think it ever did in pictures or on camera. Very, very nice knife. And with this titanium, 3D machined titanium pocket clip, very nice, very classy. Feels like a more expensive knife than it is, even though it's the most expensive knife in this test today. Build quality on these knives they're all pretty good, or at least fair for their price. The only quality complaint I would have about any of these is that the CRKT came with the tip slightly rounded out. If I try and do an example of this, if I slide my finger down here on the drifter, you'll see that that catches my finger straight away. Do I have another knife to demonstrate that with you? This ZT here, even though this is more used, it'll still catch my finger a bit more, and it's been used and it's been resharpened many times. This CRKT though, I can do this with the tip, and it doesn't catch my finger at all. And I haven't resharpened this knife yet. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but the tip is just rounded off from the factory, which is not very good, especially since knives like this usually excel at very precise, delicate cutting tasks. To have a tip rounded off from the factory, it's not great. Other than that though, they are all pretty good. There's no real horizontal blade play in any of these, and the centering is very good in all of these as well. The Symmetry is not the easiest knife to maintain. All of the screws here are T6, every single one of them. Now it's nice that they use the same screws all over so that you only need one tool, but they are all T6, and they used a lot of strong Loctite on this knife, and that's a really bad combination. Small headed screws, a lot of force required to break the Loctite. I ended up having to really seriously heat some of the clip screws when I tried to reverse the clip later on, because I couldn't break that Loctite. It was definitely far too much Loctite. Once you're through that, it seems to be okay. The screws are of a pretty decent quality. They survived the torque that I put on them, so that was pretty good. Once you've broken the Loctite, it's fine, but before that, it's a bit of a pain. The Civivi is fine for disassembly. It's all T6 except the pivot, which is T8. There's a couple more steps to disassembling this knife than you would think, but if you just start from this side, take off the clip, take off the handle screws, and just keep working your way down, you'll probably get through okay, and it went back together pretty easily and pretty nicely as well. The Slayback is the easiest knife to disassemble I have ever owned. There's 3 screws you need to take out to disassemble it. They are all T8, which is absolutely wonderful. And they work great, and they're on a small knife, and they still use T8, and everything's brilliant. Monterey Bay have they've proved to me at least that you absolutely can make a small knife and still put T8 screws on it, and it doesn't look ridiculous, and it doesn't cause any problems. So well done Monterey Bay for giving us all T8 screws on this knife. That is excellent. All 3 of these knives carry pretty well. The Symmetry and the Monterey Bay carry very straight in the pocket. The Appalachian Drifter wins some bonus points for hanging like that, curving into the back of your pocket, and it carries very nicely. The Appalachian Drifter, I would definitely say, is the best in the pocket. It also has the only deep carry clip here. These two both carry relatively shallow. The Monterey Bay carries at around about that depth, the Symmetry around about this depth, and the Appalachian Drifter just completely disappears. So, the Drifter is my winner in the carry category. However, in terms of the pocket clip itself, the Civivi is absolutely in last place for me, because although it works fine and it carries very well, I think this clip is really ugly. It's a non-reversible clip, and it causes a pretty serious hotspot for me when I'm actually using this knife. When I grip this knife in my hand, I can absolutely feel this clip in almost any grip, and I don't like it. It doesn't feel nice. The tip of this clip I can feel digging into my pan most of the time, and I can feel the back edges a lot of the time as well. Other than that, the clip is fine. The base of the clip and the clip screws are recessed, so in and out of the pocket it is very nice and smooth. So functionally it's okay. Ergonomically it's an issue for me, but your hands will be different, so you might not find that problem. I do think it's pretty ugly though. It looks like a clip from a far cheaper knife. The Monterey Bay is my favourite clip from the group, despite it being the shallowest carry. It is a lovely 3D machine titanium clip. It has lovely retention, it is nice and snappy, and it is contoured over the top. It might be quite hard for you to see that on camera, But oh no, you can think you can see it pretty clearly. There is a curve to the top of this clip. And that just makes it so lovely in the hand. I can hardly feel the clip at all in my hand when I'm using this knife, which is quite impressive. It's very common for pocket clips to be hot spots on pocket knives, and I'm very glad that this one is contoured over the top because it just doesn't give me any hot spot whatsoever. The CRKT is the only knife here which has a reversible clip, and I'm still not entirely clear if it's supposed to be. The reversing process is slightly more involved than your average knife. I did make a video on my channel of reversing this pocket clip, as well as a video on just the disassembly of this knife if you'd like to see that. So the pocket clip can absolutely be reversed. It is the only pocket clip in this group that can be reversed, and I think that's a pretty big deal because all of these knives are identical functionally for left and right handed people. They all have flipper tabs which are in the middle of the knife, which is fine, and they're all non-locking, so there is no lock, which is better for a right or left handed person. So every one of these knives would be identical for a left-handed person or a right-handed person if they all had reversible clips, but only the CRKT does. So that is a big win for me for the CRKT. And if you're left-handed, that might just make the decision for you in favour of the CRKT there. The clip on the Symmetry is also not my favourite in the hand, but it's pretty normal. It's not giving me any really bad hot spots. I can feel it, but it's okay. That's kind of what I expect out of a lot of pocket knife clips. On the Ontario Rat Model 1 here, I can still feel that clip. It's not causing me discomfort and things, but I can still feel it. And that's kind of the same with the Symmetry here. It's not as bad, in my opinion, as the Drifter's clip, and not as pleasant in my hand as the Slaybacks. All three of these knives have very thin, slicey blades, but the Civivi is by far the thinnest tipped knife of the group, and in fact the thinnest tipped knife I own, and by a significant margin. Look how thin that tip is. If I bring out something with a thicker tip to compare it to, look at the difference in tips there. Try and hold these both in one hand and up at my hand underneath. Yeah, this Civivi is unbelievably thin in the tip. It's like a sheet of paper at the end. It's unbelievable. It is a very, very thin, very, very slicey blade, and as a result it glides through material effortlessly. It's a brilliant cutting knife, but this tip will be exceptionally fragile. You definitely do not want to even consider prying anything with this tip, and some cutting tasks where the blade maybe gets a little bit of flex if you're cutting into something quite dense, you probably want to avoid that as well. This is a very, very thin blade, and I would definitely be a bit concerned about it. I believe Civivi's Damascus is based on 9CR, so that's a pretty decent steel. It's held a fine edge for me so far, so I think that'll probably be fine. It's certainly not the most premium blade steel of the group, but it's a long way above the 8CR of the the CRKT. There's a lot of C's going on at the moment. The blade also has no text on it whatsoever, which is really pleasant, looks very nice. And it has this lovely clip point style and a nice fuller as well. And fullers do occasionally catch dirt, but with it ending in this kind of swedge almost for the clip point, any dirt in there you could be able to just kind of slide out the end. So the fuller should clean out quite easily. And I think the blade looks great. It certainly ground very nicely, and the sharpening job on this from the factory was excellent. I haven't had to sharpen it yet, and it is still holding a very good edge, and it came with an exceptionally good edge. And even when this knife does dull with a blade this thin, it will probably cut remarkably well even when it is dull, simply because the blade is so thin. The CRKT has a thin blade, certainly not as thin as the Civivi's. You can see that there, but it's still a pretty thin blade. This blade is 8CR 13 MOV, which is not great, and to be honest is kind of a bit poor at this price. It's not the worst blade steel in the world, certainly. It's a lot better than your 3CRs and your surgical stainlesses and that kind of thing. But 8CR is not great. One of the benefits that 8CR usually has is corrosion resistance, but I've noticed some little spots, tiny little spots of rust showing up like back here. and this appears to be a bead blasted finish, so I have heard from people before that a bead blasting finish can open the knife up to corrosion more than it normally would be, so perhaps that's what's going on here. But I mean, as you can see, it's barely noticeable. I doubt you'll be able to see any trace of it on camera, so it's not something that I'm worried about. The Slayback has a Wharncliffe style blade, which might not be for everyone. If you prefer more of a conventional blade shape, then you might want to have a look at the Monterey Bay Knives EWC, which stands for Everywhere Carry. Made by the same company, out of the same materials. Very, very similar knife, both designed by the same people, both flip joints, very similar. Essentially, this is a Wharncliffe version of the EWC. Personally though, I love a Wharncliffe, especially for EDC tasks, because they are brilliant at cutting like into things, getting into packages, boxes, that kind of thing. As long as you're not having to cut like down onto a flat surface, Wharncliffes tend to do that work that isn't cutting down onto a flat surface. They tend to do very well. So I'm a fan of Wharncliffes, and that's why I went for the Slayback over the EWC. This blade is also an excellent slicer, despite starting with quite thick blade stock, not compared to, for example, the ZT that we had out earlier. Definitely thinner than that, but not as thin as either of the other two. But if we hold it up even against the Civivi here, you can see that the tip is far from fat, really. It's still nice and thin and slicey. It's just not going to be as fragile as the Civivi. On top of that, this blade is M390, which has excellent corrosion resistance, it has excellent edge retention, and it's definitely going to be a considerable cut above the other two knives here in terms of blade steel. If the Appalachian Drifter was an S35VN, it would be a little bit closer, but I would still say M390 is the better blade steel overall, but the better blade steel certainly for a knife like this. And we have to give Monterey Bay an extra little bonus here, because there is a steel label on this knife, and it's there. You see M390 written on the blade there. That is a steel label, which is completely invisible in the open position. That's not it, that's a bit of dirt. And completely invisible in the closed position. So well done to them for that. In terms of the markings that are on this blade, see there's a little Monterey Bay Knives logo here, which is pretty classy, and the designer's name, Ray Laconico, on the spine, which is, again, very classy in my opinion. I really like that. The designer's name on the spine thing, I hope, is something that we see a bit more, but maybe a little bit further down so they can put some jimping on the spine would be great. None of these knives have that, so I'm not going to bring it up anymore in this comparison, but I would have liked some spine jimping on any of these. So in case you can't tell, the MBK is my favourite blade of the group, because it's of a higher quality. It's a Wharncliffe, which I prefer for this sort of knife at least. But there is a couple caveats to that, and the main one is if you want an ultra thin slicey knife, maybe you carry a more durable knife and a thin slicey knife, and you keep your thin slicey knife very sharp and kind of use and abuse your thick and more durable knife. That's how my dad does it. This might be great for you because the blade is very, very thin. Because the blade is so thin, I wouldn't really want this to be my only knife, which is why I'd go for the blade of the Slayback over the blade of the Appalachian Drifter, because I am a little bit concerned about how thin that blade is. Ergonomically, none of these knives are a complete disaster, but as I'm sure you've been able to guess so far, the Civivi is my least favourite ergonomically, mostly because of the clip, but I also find that this curve towards the end of the handle kind of bunches my fingers up a bit much, and I'm not really a big fan of that. If this had just been a little bit more gentle and the pocket clip had have been a little bit more, I don't know, but different in some way, then this might be a whole lot more of an ergonomic knife. But it's not a disaster, it's okay. It's only really losing out by comparison to the other two. In its own video, I would probably be saying that the ergonomics aren't great, but they're not the worst. The symmetry is fine. Symmetry is completely okay. There's a little bit of a hot spot off the clip, but not much. Nothing out of the norm really. Symmetry's ergonomics are completely fine, but the Slayback is great. Slayback is very, very comfortable, at least in my hands, and it is getting a lot of points because that clip is rounded off at the top and I get no hot spot from the clip. It's the most comfortable clip on a knife that I've encountered so far. So ergonomically, I'd give the win to the Slayback. Ray Laconico did a great job with that knife ergonomically. In terms of value, the Symmetry is the cheapest by a country mile. The Symmetry is £52, which is not horrible, but I wouldn't want to spend any more on it than that, simply because, well, a bit because of the bearings and it's not as smooth as I kind of hoped it would be. That might just be mine, I guess, though. But this blade is, like I said, it's 8CR, and £52 for 8CR is quite a big ask. I think that's only really acceptable because there isn't many flip joints out there yet, certainly not many in this price point, and it does look very good. But I think 8CR for that money is a bit of a stretch. The Appalachian Drifter, this model of the Drifter, costs around about £100. That's pretty good value. I can certainly see why. The carbon and G10 mix is not going to be a cheap material, even though I don't really like it. And the Damascus blade is certainly very nice. You don't see that very often on knives in this price point. It's usually on several £100 knives at least. And this Damascus is, from what I've read and from what I've experienced with this and the McKenna, which I haven't had either of these knives that long, so I haven't had too much experience with either of these Damascuses, but the blade's not going to be functionally as good in terms of blade steel as something like the Slayback, but it is good. It's a perfectly functional blade, and it is a Damascus sort of pattern welded style steel, so if you really like that, you might really like this. Around about £100 is not too bad for it, but the Monterey Bay isn't a huge amount more money, and for me, because of the safety issue mostly, that there's nothing for me to grip to stop this knife closing on my fingers, mostly because of that, I would rather save up and go for one of the Monterey Bay models. So speaking of which, the Monterey Bay, I ordered this direct from Monterey Bay's website. It cost £150 including shipping, which is about 3 times as much as the Symmetry, which is a lot of money, but despite that, I think this is the best value knife here. This carbon's lovely, the screws are brilliant, the blade steel's as high end as they come, more or less. All of the machining work here is done brilliantly. It has full nested liners, which is very nice. It has this lovely pocket clip that we've talked about before. It's a very, very nice knife. It's a very, very premium product, and it feels like it, and it acts like it. And yeah, in my opinion, it's the best knife here, and it's worth saving up that extra 50 quid over the Appalachian Drifter and going for the MBK. It's the most ergonomic, the most easy to maintain, the smoothest and the safest. It's definitely my winner. So I guess in conclusion, if you can save up that bit extra and go for the Slayback, I think you should. If you really want ultra slicey, that's your only priority, the Civivi is probably going to be your winner, but be a bit careful with the tip and be quite careful with your fingers as well. The Symmetry is fine if you want a flip joint and you don't want to spend too much money, or you're left-handed and you like to carry a knife on the left-hand side, in which case this might be the knife for you. Personally though, if I was going to buy a UK legal for around £52, I would spend £15 less and I would get the Heine Haynes edition CRKT pillar. Same blade steel, it's thicker, it's not as slicey, but it is way more ergonomic and it's safer feeling and tougher feeling, and they are quite different, but I would rather spend £35 on the pillar than £52 on the Symmetry. For the Appalachian Drifter for around £100, I would very seriously consider buying a Spyderco UK PK. This one's an S110V. The S110V model starts around 110, and I've added custom scales to it because I really didn't like the FRN ones that it came with. So this one's quite a bit more money. This is more in line with the Monterey Bay, but a standard UK PK or the Heine Haynes edition UK PK will probably be a bit cheaper than this and should give you a better blade steel, will definitely give you better ergonomics, at least for my hands, and it's quite a bit safer. The D10 is way stronger on this than it is on any of the other knives in this test, and with that front finger choil, you're completely locked in, you're completely safe. So for around £100, I would go for this, unless I was determined to get a flip joint. Once you get up to around £150 though, yeah, I would absolutely take the Slayback. There's not another knife UK legal for this money that I would choose over the Slayback. The only one that fights with the Slayback for time in my pocket when I'm not carrying something that I'm going to be reviewing is the Hinderer XM Slippy, which is twice the price, more or less, of the Slayback. And it's a great knife, but it's incredible how good the Slayback is for half the money of the XM Slippy. So that's going to be it for this video. It has been a long one, so if you've made it right to the end, thank you very much for watching me for this length of time. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been informative. If you want any more information about these knives, although I'm sure you're sick of hearing about them after 35 minutes anyway, but if you do want any more information, I'm going to have individual reviews out on these in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's helped, and bye-bye.